Okay, so we're learning today the Gemara on Daf Tzadik Zayin Amud Aleph, 6 lines into the Amud. Omar Shmuel. So before we learn the Gemara, just let's review B'kitzer, the halacha that we learned in the Mishnah. Speaking about a case where a person was makdish a korban Pesach, and then it got lost, so he was makdish a second korban Pesach. So usually the halacha is, what happens with a Meiser Pesach, which means you have a second korban Pesach that you never ended up bringing. It becomes a shlomim. But we learned in the Mishnah, it depends when you found that korban Pesach that was lost. If you found it before the shechita of the korban Pesach, it's not called Meiser Pesach, it's called a Pesach that was rejected. Because you had it there available to use at the time of the shechita, and you didn't. So it's rejected, and therefore what happens with it is, you have to let it go out and graze to get a mum, and you sell it, and then you can use the money for a shlomim. If you found that korban Pesach that you lost after the shechita, so at the time of the shechita it wasn't available b'chlal, that will be called Meiser Pesach, and then you can bring it as a shlomim, like the halacha of Meiser Pesach. That's the halacha that it said in the Mishnah. So we had yesterday a machlokes, which will be very relevant for the Gemara today. The machlokes was between Rabbe and Rab Zera. So Rabbe says that this distinction of when you find that korban that you lost is, so what's the point that you have to look at? When did you find it? Before the shechita or after the shechita, as I just explained. But Rab Zera says, no, you don't look at the actual shechita itself. You look at the time when you could shech the korban Pesach, which is starting from Chatzais. If you found your korban Pesach before Chatzais, so that means you had this korban Pesach there at the time that the shechita could be done, so it's considered to be rejected. If you found it after Chatzais, so at the time when the Chatzais came, when the korban Pesach could be brought, you didn't have that korban there, so it's not considered to be a rejected korban. You find it afterwards, so now it could be brought as a shlomim. That's the opinion of Rab Zera. So the Gemara here is going to bring a statement from Shmuel, and then a statement of Rabbi Yochanan, and eventually what the Gemara is going to say is that Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan are arguing in the same machlokes as Rabbe and Rab Zera. But until we get to that conclusion, there's going to be a little bit of a road over here to get to that. So let's begin to see what the Gemara says. Amar Shmuel, so Shmuel said the following rule. Kol shebechatos meisa. Anytime you find by a korban chatos that the halacha will be that the korban chatos has to be left to die. So then, in that kind of a case, with Pesach, if something similar happens by a korban Pesach, karev shlomim. The korban is brought as a shlomim. So what is Shmuel talking about? When do you find by a korban chatos that the animal is left to die? So Rashi says this is a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. There are 5 different examples by a korban chatos that if it couldn't be brought as a korban chatos, it's left to die. You can look in Rashi. Rashi says one example is a korban chatos that gave birth. Another one is a tmura of a chatos. We learned yesterday the halacha of a tmura, when you designated another one to be like the korban chatos. So that also is not brought as a korban, it's left to die. And the owner of the korban chatos died. Or a case where the korban chatos was not used in the end, because the owner had a second korban chatos that he used. This is the case that's the most relevant for our Gemara. That's similar to what we had before. Just like over here, person brought a korban Pesach, and then that korban Pesach got lost and he brought a second one. So by korban chatos, there's a similar thing. A person had a korban chatos that he designated, it got lost, and then he designated a second one, and he didn't end up using it, the first one, because it was lost. And then the last case Rashi brings is that a korban chatos that is already a year old. The behema is a year old. It can't be used for a korban chatos. That's a similar halacha regarding a korban Pesach as well. A korban Pesach has to be brought only from an animal that's under a year old. So in all of these cases, by korban chatos, the halacha is, once it wasn't used for any of these reasons, what do you do with the korban chatos? You have to take it into a place and leave it there to die. That's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So came Shmuel and said that in all of these cases that you have by a korban chatos that you leave it to die, if there's a similar thing that happens regarding a korban Pesach, so then it's brought as a shlomim. That was the halacha of Shmuel. So simply speaking, Shmuel was referring to all of these cases by chatos, besides one of them that it's obvious that Shmuel was not referring to, which is the case of Vlad chatos. The reason is because a korban chatos is brought from an akeva, so it's a possibility that it gives birth. by a carbon Pesach, it's not brought from an akeva. It has to be a zachar, so it's not going to give birth. Then Shmuel continued and said as follows: V'chol shebechatas roya. Any time that the halacha by a chatas is going to be that if it wasn't brought for a chatas, so then you leave it to graze until it gets a mum, and then the money is used for other karbanis. So bepesach nami roya. By a carbon pesach, same as a chatas, it'll also be left to graze. And the Gemara will later discuss when is it this case that by a carbon chatas you leave it to graze. Not so simple. In the end, the Gemara is going to say there is really no such a case that applies to what Shmuel said, as we'll see. But the Gemara will discuss it. Okay, so that was the rule that Shmuel said. Rashi explains here, when Shmuel says this rule, it would seem like Shmuel is trying to compare a chatos to a Pesach, and he's giving this kind of a rule to compare them. It's not the pshat in what Shmuel is saying. Shmuel is simply saying chatos has his own set of rules, Pesach has his own set of rules regarding a carbon that wasn't brought. He's just giving you this kind of a siman. It so happens to be that a chatos, regarding all those cases where it says that it's left to die, by a carbon Pesach, if it wasn't brought, so then the Pesach is used as a shlomim. And those by a chatos that are left to graze, it so happens to be that by Pesach it'll be the same thing, that it'll be left to graze. But the Gemara will discuss, is it really so? Could we give this as a siman, comparing Pesach to chatos? We'll see. Now the Gemara brings another opinion which argued on Shmuel. Rav Yochanan said, what's the rule regarding a carbon Pesach that got lost and then you found it and it wasn't used as a carbon? So then Eina Pesach Korev Shlomim, so that Pesach that you lost and now found is not going to be brought as a Shlomim, Ela Shanimtza Acha Shchita, if you found it after the Shchita of that carbon that you did use, so it was never rejected. As we said before, as we saw in the Mishnah, Aval Kaidim Shchita, but if you found it before Shchita, so then it was there, and you didn't use it, that's not called a leftover of a carbon Pesach. That was rejected from a carbon, and therefore you do not shechter as a shlomim. So what Rabbi Yochanan is saying seems to be the exact halacha of what it said in the Mishnah. And you read the Gemara here, it seems to be saying that Rabbi Yochanan is arguing on what Shmuel said. And it's not very clear what exactly is the machlokes between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. So that as well will be explained in the Gemara later. And eventually, just to say it now, because it's very difficult here, the whole hemshech of the Gemara, but eventually the Gemara will say that Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan are arguing the same machlokes as Rabba and Rab Zera, whether we look at the shchita itself or we look at the zman of the shchita, which is chatzais, the machlokes that we learned yesterday that I mentioned before. But here the Gemara first starts with trying to explain what Shmuel said. Maskefla Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef asked on the klal of Shmuel, and he's asking now on the second half of what Shmuel said. So Shmuel said, anytime by a carbon chatas that it's left to graze, the same thing is going to be also by a carbon pesach. So the question is, v'klalahu, could you make this klal? Could you compare it? V'harei chatos she'ovra shnasa. In a case of a carbon chatos that it's after behemoth is more than a year old, the leraya ozla. So the halacha will be that it's left to graze. So Rashi explains it actually depends, because a carbon chatos that's more than a year old, and the reason why it became a year old was because it got lost. You were going to bring it before it was a year old, but it got lost, and therefore then you found it after it was a year old. In such a case, it actually has to be left to die. The case the Gemara is talking about now over here is a carbon chatos that you designated. It didn't get lost, but you just delayed it. You didn't end up bringing it until it became a year old. So if it didn't get lost, what's the halacha? Leraya ozla. This carbon chatos is not left to die. It has to go out to graze, and then you sell it, like the halacha when such a case. And the Gemara brings the source, the Amr Abshim ben Lakish, chatos she'avra shnasa, carbon chatos that it's more than a year old, royenoisa ki'ilu hui oimedes bebeis hakvaris. This animal is treated as if it's in a beis hakvaris. It's a very interesting expression. The Gemara means to say, just like an animal which is in the beis hakvaris, a kohen can't go into the beis hakvaris to make himself tamei to shecht it. So it's just an analogy the Gemara is using to say that a kohen can't shecht this animal. Okay, Taisva says it's a little bit of an unusual example. The Gemara is saying this because there's nothing really that went wrong with this animal. It's not like if this mum happened to it, or that the owner died, or something else. It's just that technically it got too old and you can't use it anymore. So therefore it gives this example of it technically being limbo. Yeah, so it's like in limbo, you can't do anything with it. That's the example. So what happens? Viroya. And you leave it to graze and get a mum. That's the halacha by a chatos that became a bas shnosa, a year old. But v'ilu bePesach, what's the halacha by a Pesach that became a year old? Kahai gavna korav shlomim. When it becomes a year old and it's too old for a korban Pesach, it automatically becomes a shlomim. Here the Gemara brings the Braisa that we had yesterday. The Tanya, the Braisa said kesev. When it speaks about korban shlomim, it says kesev and it's extra. It says already before which animal it speaks about. Why does it say again kesev? L'rabbis es ha-Pesach la'alya. It's coming to teach you, just like by the Shlomim. So the tail is brought on the Mizbeach, so too by the Pesach, the tail is brought on the Mizbeach. And then, Kshuayme im kesev, the word im, what does that come to teach you? L'rabbis es ha-Pesach, that's saying that there's another carbon which will also be a Shlomim. And what is that? A Pesach she'avra shnasai, a Pesach that became too old for a carbon Pesach, so it's brought as a Shlomim. Shlomim habayim machmas Pesach, or any other carbon Pesach that's left over that becomes a Shlomim. And what's the halacha? L'chol mitzvah Shlomim. We say that these karbonis Pesach that turn into a Shlomim, you apply all the halachas of a Shlomim. Shatunim smiche, nesachim, tnufe, chazav v'shoik, all these details that are by a carbon Shlomim apply to this carbon Pesach that turns into a Shlomim as well. Braisa concludes, Keshu Aimer im eis, then when it says, if you bring a goat, Hifsek inyan, the word im separates from the lamb that it speaks about before. Limad ala eis she'ein ton alya. When it comes to a goat, you do not bring the tail on the mizbeach. So what does it say here in this Braisa? It says clearly that a carbon Pesach that became a year old, it becomes a shlomim. So you can't compare it to a chatos that becomes a year old that we leave it out to graze. So how did Shmuel say that we compare Pesach to a chatos in that sense? Amalei, so he answered, some take out the word Amalei because it's not clear who answered this. Rav Yosef just asked this question, he didn't ask it to anyone specific. So the answer is, Ki ka'ama Shmuel, when did Shmuel say his halacha? In other words, the Gemara is now going back to the entire statement of Shmuel. There's two parts to Shmuel's statement. The first part that we compare Pesach to Chatos, that any time a carbon Chatos is left to die, a carbon Pesach is brought as a Shlomim. And the second half, that we compare Chatas and Pesach regarding the fact that they both go out to graze. So the Gemara is now saying the entire statement of Shmuel ba'avudin. He was only referring to a carbon Chatos or a carbon Pesach that got lost and then was found. And the question is, what do you do with it now? B'dechoyin lo yomar. He wasn't speaking about all the cases where you have a carbon that was pushed off for another reason. So before we saw that there were 5 cases that a carbon Chatas is left to die. All of them are basically carbonis that are pushed off from being a carbon. The owner died, or all the cases that we had over there. It's a carbon tumura that's not meant to be brought as a carbon, a vlad that's not meant to be brought as a... All those cases are pushed off, they're not shaykh to b'chlal to be brought as a carbon. The only case that Shmuel was really speaking about is the case of where it got lost. And regarding that case where it got lost, here Shmuel was saying sometimes the carbon chatas, when it gets lost, it's left to die. Sometimes the carbon chatas, when it gets lost, you leave it to graze. So, and then we compare carbon Pesach to carbon chatas, and we say that when the carbon chatas is left to die, a carbon Pesach is brought as a shlomim. When a carbon chatas is left to graze, so then a carbon Pesach is also left to graze. So he was only talking about the case of avudin. But b'duchoyin lo yamar. So therefore the question that we had regarding avra shnasa is also considered to be duchoyin. It never got lost, it's just that it became too old, so it got pushed off of being used as a carbon. That's a case that Shmuel never spoke about. And therefore there's no question from the fact that Shmuel compared them, and we saw clearly that we can't compare them regarding that case. He never spoke about that. Frag the Gemara. So now let's look at the case of when it gets lost. Could we actually say what Shmuel said regarding a carbon chatas that got lost and a carbon pesach that got lost? Are they compared? V'avod, so regarding a carbon chatas that got lost and a carbon pesach that got lost, mi mishkach aslam, is it going to make sense to compare the way Shmuel said? V'harei, and could it, in other words, the Gemara is really asking, is there any case by a carbon chatas, if it got lost, that you leave it out to graze? Is there such a thing, b'chlal? V'harei avudam, v'harei, let's see. So the Gemara's question over here is, Shmuel said 2 parts in the statement. Shmuel said sometimes a carbon chatos is, if it gets lost, it has to be left to die, and sometimes a carbon chatos, if it gets lost, it's left to graze. So the Gemara's question over here is actually on the first part of what Shmuel said. do you find a case that a carbon chatos that got lost, that it's left to die? And the Gemara brings you a Mishnah that clearly speaks about a case of a carbon chatos that got lost, and it brings a machlokes about this. Vaharei avuda b'shas afrosha. A carbon chatos that was lost, and then you were mafresh, you designated another carbon chatos. So what's the halacha? L'Rabbanon, the Rabbanon's opinion is the l'raya ozla. That second carbon chatos was now used as a carbon chatos, and the first one was lost when you were mafresh your second carbon chatos, and you found it before shchita. What happens before the shchita of the second carbon chatos? What do you do with it? L'raya ozla. You leave it out to graze. It's not left to die. The Tanan, so there's a Mishnah that says, Hifrish chatasai va'avda. You were mafresh one carbon chatas and that got lost. Then v'hifrish acheres tachtea, then you were mafresh a second one. And v'nimtze sarishayna, and you found the first one before the shchita. So what do you do with it? V'hareshtem oimdais, you have both of them available to be brought for the shchita. So achas men tikraf, so one of them you're gonna shecht and bring it as a carbon chatas, so shniya tamus. And the second one, you leave to die. Divrei Rebbe, that's Rebbe's opinion. The Chachamim say, Ein chatas meisa, a chatas that was lost and then later found is not going to be left to die. Ela shenimtzis la'achash neskapru bailim. Only if it was found after you brought the carbon chatas of the second carbon chatas that you designated, only if it was found afterwards, then it's left to die. But otherwise, if it was found before, it's left to graze. That's the opinion of the Chachamim. So what do we see from here? What do the Chachamim hold? Hakaydim sheneskapru bailim. If you found your lost carbon chatas before you shechted your second one, roya, so then the halacha is going to be that you leave it to graze. Right, so and then what did Shmuel say? Shmuel said, any time you leave a carbon chatas to graze, you leave a carbon pesach also to graze. Right, so over here, what is it saying? That if you found your carbon chatas before the shchita of your second carbon chatas, you leave it to graze. Is that true also by a carbon pesach? That if you find your second carbon pesach before the shchita, you leave it out to graze? So the Gemara here is going to say, no, that's not the halacha, and the Gemara is saying this based on the opinion of Rab Zera. The ilu bePesach, when it comes to our carbon Pesach, heichid avad. If it got lost, v'nimtza acha chatzais. You found it after chatzais, the time when you could bring a carbon Pesach. Kaidim shchita. It's still before shchita, but it's already after chatzais. So according to the opinion of Rab Zera, what's the halacha? Karev shlamim. In such a case, it's brought as a shlamim. That's what we said before. According to Rab Zera, since at the time of Chatzais, which is the time that the carbon Pesach could be brought, it was still not found. It was only found after Chatzais, so it was never pushed off of being a carbon, and therefore it becomes a shlamim. So the question is, how could Shmuel say that any time a carbon Chatas is left to graze, a carbon Pesach is also left to graze? It's not the same thing. A carbon Chatas, if it's found before Shchita, it's left to graze, as the Rabbanan just said over here. And when it comes to carbon Pesach, as long as it's found after Chatzais, even if it's found before the Shchita, it actually does become a carbon Shlamim. And as I said, this is according to the opinion of Rab Zera. So therefore, if we follow Rab Zera's opinion, what Shmuel said, the comparison Shmuel made doesn't make sense. Rashi here says, and the Gemara will later say it, the Gemara right here should have suggested to say, who says Shmuel holds like Rab Zera? Maybe Shmuel holds like Rabba. As long as it's found before Shchita, so then it's left to graze. So then the comparison of Shmuel to Chatas is perfect. A Chatas found before Shchita is left to graze, and a Carbon Pesach found before Shchita is left to graze. So the Gemara soon will go through this piece of Gemara and then make that insert right over here, and we'll suggest that, and the Gemara will explain why you can't say that. But here the Gemara gives a different answer. Says the Gemara, you're asking a question based on the Rabbanan's opinion. So we'll have to say that Shmuel doesn't hold like the Rabbanan. Shmuel kerebi svirele. Shmuel holds like Rebbe, the Amar, the Rebbe said, avuda lemisa. That ozla, that an animal, a carbon pesach, that got lost is always going to be left to die. It's not left to graze. So that's so when Shmuel said the halacha before that all the chatois that are left to die, so by a Pesach it's brought as a shlamim, so that fits with what Rebbe said right over here. Rebbe is saying that if it's found before the shchita by a carbon chatos, it's left to die, and by a carbon Pesach, it's brought as a shlamim, as long as it's found after chatzos. Okay, so therefore, we're following the opinion of Rebbe, not the opinion of the Rabbanon. Fragt the Gemara, but wait a minute. How could Shmuel be going according to the opinion of Rebbe? V'hakol avuda leRebbe meisa. Rebbe's opinion is, when it comes to a carbon chatos, any time it got lost, no matter what circumstance it is, doesn't make a difference when you found your carbon chatos. It's always left to die. V'ilu b'Pesach, however, when it comes to a carbon Pesach, you can't compare it to a chatos and say that it's always going to be brought as a shlomim. Heiche de avad kaidem chatzais. If you lost it before chatzais and v'nimtza kaidem chatzais, and you found it before chatzais, what happens then? Roya, then it's left to graze. So how can we say this klal? If by a carbon chatos, no matter when it's found, it's always going to be left to die. So by a carbon pesach, no matter when it's found, it could always be brought as a shlom. No, that's not true. If it's found before chatzais, then it's considered to be a rejected carbon, and then it has to be left to graze. So we can't say that what Shmuel says goes according to Rebbe. Says the Gemara, no, wait, if it's found before chatzais, that's not even considered to be lost b'chlal. So the Gemara, kaidem chatzais lav avotu. You're telling me the case by carbon Pesach where it was lost before Chatzais and it was also found before Chatzais. That's not considered to be lost. In other words, Shmuel wasn't talking about that kind of a case. As we said before, Shmuel was comparing a Pesach to a Chatos only regarding a case where it got lost. If it got lost before the time that it could be brought as a carbon, and you found it before the time it could be brought as a carbon, that's not called lost. You found it already before. And the Gemara brings another example of this. You say the same thing regarding a chatos. Kiderave, as Rave said regarding a chatos, the Omar Rave, Aveidas Laila, Lav Shma Aveida. If you lost your carbon chatos at night, which is a time when you can't bring your chatos, and you found it still at night, so then that's not called an Aveda. You're not going to say that it's going to be left to die. Now, Rebbe's shitta was, no matter when you found it, if it got lost, it's left to die by carbon chatas. But there's an exception. If you found it still at night, then it's not left to die. Why? Because at night is not a time where it's considered to be lost at all. It's not as man that it could be brought as a carbon. So therefore, that's not a question. So therefore, we could say that Shmuel fits with Rebbe's opinion. But the question now still is, how are we going to explain the second half of Shmuel's statement? We understand the first half of Shmuel's statement. Anytime a chatos is left to die, a carbon pesach is brought as a shlomim. Right? And then the Gemara now explained that fits. But the question is, the second half of Shmuel's statement that he said that if a carbon chatas is left to graze, a carbon pesach is also left to graze, when does that apply? If we're saying that Shmuel holds like Rebbe's opinion is a carbon chatas that was lost is never left to graze. It always has to die. So when is Shmuel saying that if it's carbon chatas is left to graze, a carbon pesach is also left to graze? When is that case? Yeah.
What's the difference?
If it's left to die, you leave it in a room or in a place without food, and you have to leave it to die. Leave it to graze means you let it get a mum, and then you sell it, and you bring another carbon. Says the Gemara, even according to Rebbe, there is a case by a carbon chatos where it's not left to die, it's left to graze. The cases of what Rabbi Ishia said. If a person, not that it got lost, but right from the beginning, he was chayiv in a carbon chatos, and he was worried it might get lost. So he, sort of as an insurance, designated 2 animals for a carbon chatos, lachrayis. So if one gets lost, he'll have the other one available. So what do? Miskaper ba'achas mehen. So then you use one of them for your chatas, and shniya, the second one, tira, it's left to graze. So here is a case where even by a chatas, it's left to graze. And that's the case that Shmuel was talking about when he mentioned that there is a carbon chatas that's left to graze. Okay, so Rashi says what the Gemara is suggesting here doesn't fit with what the Gemara just said before, because the Gemara said before that Shmuel is only dealing with cases where the carbon got lost. That was the comparison of Chatas to Pesach, Ba'avudin. This case of Rabbi Ishia is not even a case where it got lost. So why is the Gemara even suggesting this? But Rashi says the Gemara is going to have a different question, or maybe even a better question. So the Gemara asks right now on this, so what are you telling me? Shmuel, when he said a chatas is left to graze, and he's comparing a Pesach and saying that a Pesach in this case is also left to graze, this is the case? When you will makdish 2 chatois, or you will makdish 2 karbanis Pesach? That can't be. But for ha'ilu be-Pesach, yihai gavne, what's the halacha about carbon Pesach? If a person, from the beginning, is makdish 2 karbanis Pesach, and then he uses one and the other one he doesn't use, That's what's called Meiser Pesach. That's the leftovers of a Pesach. It never got lost. That's the typical case of Meiser Pesach and Karev Shlomim. It's brought as a Shlomim. So how could we say that this is the case that Shmuel meant to say, that we're comparing Chatas to Pesach, that in such a case, just like by Chatas it's left to graze, so too by Pesach it's left to graze. By a Pesach in such a case it's brought as a Shlomim.
It's not nicer?
No. This is not nice. Nice is a carbon that was shechted and you didn't finish all the meat. This is a extra carbon Pesach. That's Meiser, extra carbon Pesach that wasn't used. So now the Gemara therefore has charate from what it suggested before, that Shmuel holds like Rebbe, and the Gemara is actually going to change the entire statement of Shmuel. It's going to cut it in half. Let's see. Zok the Gemara, Ela Shmuel Rab Shimon Svirele. Shmuel holds like Rab Shimon and not like Rebbe. The Omar, Rab Shimon said, Chomesh Chatois Meisais, that there are 5 examples of a carbon chatas that are left to die, and V'haroye. So, 1 second. So, according to Rab Shimon, there's no such a thing in any case where a carbon chatas is left to graze. Every carbon chatas, there's only one halacha. A carbon chatas is left to die. And so, if you lost your carbon chatas, no matter when you found it, it's left to die. Even this case of Rabbi Shia, if you makdish 2 karbanas chatas right from the beginning, and you used one and not the other one, it's left to die. That's Rab Shimon's opinion. So now wait, so the Gemara says, so Shmuel is going according to Rab Shimon's opinion, so what happens with the second part of what Shmuel said? V'haroye l'Rab Shimon lesle klal. Rab Shimon does not hold to such a thing that you leave the carbon chatas to go to graze. So Shmuel, so how did Shmuel say in the second part of a statement, comparing Pesach to chatas, that sometimes it's left to graze? So the Gemara says, no, so what we mean not to say is, Shmuel nami chada ka'amar. Shmuel only said one point. We have to erase the second point of what Shmuel said. He never said that. What did Shmuel say? Shmuel said as follows. Kol shebechatas meisa, anytime by a carbon chatas it's left to die, Pesach karev shlomim. By a carbon Pesach, it's brought as a shlomim. That was the whole statement of Shmuel. The second part of the statement about grazing, he did not say. Because he's going according to Rab Shimon. And there's no such a thing of a carbon chatas being left to graze. Okay? But now the point is, there are 2 points that the Gemara said before on Amar Aleph that the Gemara is still sticking to. The Gemara is not retracting from what it said before. Let me just remind you, what are the 2 points that the Gemara said before? Number 1, Shmuel was only comparing a Pesach to chatas regarding a case of where it gets lost, not regarding the other psulim of a chatas. Avudin, that was the case we was comparing them. Number 2, when do you consider something to be lost? If it's lost within the time that the carbon could be brought. Regarding carbon Pesach, that would be after Chatzais. Regarding a carbon Chatas, that would be daytime. If it's lost before Chatzais and you found it before Chatzais, or carbon Chatas that's lost at night and you found it at night, that's not called lost. Right? So Shmuel was talking about a case where the carbon Chatas and the carbon was found by day and the carbon Pesach was found after Chatzais. And on that Shmuel is saying that it's brought as a Shlomim. You compare it to the Chatas and it's brought as a Shlomim. Says the Gemara, Umay kamashmalon. So what was Shmuel trying to say here? What was the chiddush of Shmuel that in such a case where you lost your carbon Pesach and you found that after Chatzais that it's brought as a shlomim? What is the chiddush? Says the Gemara, la'afukim ed Rabbi Yochanan. His chiddush was to exclude or to argue with what Rabbi Yochanan said. And here we'll see, here the Gemara concludes that Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel are arguing in the same machlokes as Rabba and Rab Zera, whether you follow the time of the Shechita or the time when it could be brought at Chatzais. So the Amma, what did Rabbi Yochanan say? Ein a Pesach karev shlomim ela shenimtzach Shechita. The Pesach is brought as a shlomim only if it's found after Shechita. But if it's found before Shechita, so then it's considered to be rejected. And you have to leave it to graze. So in other words, Rabbi Yochanan is going according to the actual Shechita itself. So al meshchita kova. That's what determines whether it's considered to be a rejected carbon or not. Kamash Milan. So what Shmuel was saying is, when Shmuel was comparing it to Chatos, it comes out from that comparison that Chatzais kova. What's koveya is the time when it could be brought. Just like by a carbon chatos, if it's found in a time that it could be brought, we say that it's left to die. By a carbon Pesach, he was comparing and saying that if it's found in a time that it could be brought, then it's brought as a shlomim. So it comes out that Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan are arguing in the same machlokes as Rabba and Rab Zera. That's the conclusion of the whole discussion here. So now, as I mentioned before, the Gemara is going to go back to the middle of the discussion that we had before on Amar Aleph, and the Gemara is going to insert a part that it did not say before, and then it's going to just continue with the same flow of the Gemara that we had until here. Lishna Achrene, another version of the discussion that we had until now that inserts another point. So before we asked the question, V'ilu bePesach heiche de'ovid v'nimtza acha chatzayis koidim shchite yikrav shlomim. It's brought as a shlomim. What was the Gemara's question? The Gemara's question was that the Gemara brought the opinion of the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon holds a carbon chatos that got lost and was found before shchite, it's left to graze. And on that the Gemara asked, but by a carbon Pesach, if it was lost and it was found after Chatzais before Shchita, so then it's brought as a Shlomim. So how did Shmuel compare the two and say that if a carbon Chatas is left to graze, that a carbon Pesach is also left to graze? That was the Gemara's question before, right? So what did the Gemara say before? That Shmuel doesn't hold like the Rabbanon, Shmuel holds like Rebbe. But now the Gemara suggests and says, as I pointed out before when we read the Gemara, instead we could just say that Shmuel holds like Rabbe. So Zok the Gemara, so the answer to that question is Shmuel k'Rabbe svirele. Shmuel really holds like Rabbe's opinion. The Omar shchita kova. Rabbe holds that what determines whether it can be brought as a shlomim or not, the shchita itself. And therefore the comparison that Shmuel is making from a chatos to a Pesach makes sense. Just like by a chatos, if it's found before Shechita, it's left to graze. So to by a Pesach, if it's found before Shechita, it's left to graze. We don't go at the time of Chatzos, we go by Shechita. And therefore the comparison works even according to the Rabbanon. Says the Gemara, but you can't say that Shmuel goes like Rabbe. Why not? Because as we just pointed out before, Shmuel really holds like Rab Zera, not like Rabbe. What did Rabbi Yochanan respond to Rabbe? The Pesach is brought as a Shlomim if it's found after Shchita. But if a Pesach is found before Shchita, it's not brought as a Shlomim. So Alme Shchita Kova. What do we see? What's Rabbi Yochanan arguing? What's Rabbi Yochanan saying? That the thing that matters is the Shchita itself. If you lost your carbon Pesach, what determines if it got rejected or not? Just the Shchita, not the timing of Chatzais, but just the Shchita. So if Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan are arguing, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan says, so Ela Shmuel, what does it come out? That Shmuel does not hold like Rabbe. Shmuel holds like Rab Zera, that we follow Chatzais. Rabbi Yochanan is the one that goes according to Rabbe, and Shmuel goes according to Rab Zera, that you go according to Chatzais. If you go according to Chatzais, so then the question that we had before is still going to be a question. By a carbon Chatos, if you found your lost animal before the Shchita, so the Rabbanan say it's left to graze, and by a carbon Pesach, if you find it before Shchita, it becomes a Shlomim. So that's the question we had before. See here, the next part of the Gemara brings the exact same thing as we said before, and here we just continue the same thing that it said before. The Gemara is just bringing this Lishna Achrene to insert this point, to try to make the suggestion that Shmuel holds like Rabbe, and to point out that it can't be because it's Rabbi Yochanan that holds like Rabbe, so it must be that Shmuel holds like Rab Zera. So now the Gemara goes back exactly what it said before. El Shmuel keRebbi svirele. We're going to have to say that Shmuel holds like Rebbe. That any time a carbon chatas gets lost, it's left to die. And on that we asked before, same thing again. Rebbe holds that any carbon chatas that gets lost is always left to die. And so how could you say that a carbon Pesach is compared to that? If it was lost and it was found before Chatzais, it's not left to die, it's left to graze. And that we answered, Kasavar, because you could compare it, because he holds, Kaidum Chatzais Lav Avadu. If it was found before Chatzais, that's not called lost. And Kesavar, and he also holds, like Rab Zera, Chatzais Kava. That Chatzais is what determines whether it could be shechted as a shlomim or not. And then the whole continuation of the Gemara, as it said before, eventually the Gemara rejects that Shmuel does not hold like Rebbe, he holds like Reb Shimon, and we erase one half of what Shmuel said, and it comes out, the conclusion of the whole thing is that this machlokes of Rabbe and Rab Zera is the same machlokes between Shmuel and Rab Yochanan.